Welcome to the Plant Fit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Cyrus Kambata and Robby Barbaro. Cyrus is an internationally recognized nutrition and fitness coach who has been living with type 1 diabetes since 2002. Robby was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 12 and has been living this lifestyle since 2006. They are both authors of the New York Times bestseller, Mastering Diabetes. They are also the founders of the Mastering Diabetes coaching program and summit. We start the conversation with Cyrus and Robby sharing about the response they've gotten since releasing their book. Enjoy the presentation.
I got to say, it took 2.5 years to put this thing together. And it was one gargantuan effort because one of the things that Robby and I actually wanted to do was make sure that we addressed things that are controversial in the world of diabetes, which there are many. And we tried to do it from as objective of a viewpoint as possible. In other words, we didn't want to go into the process only talking about the stuff that we know and not talking about the counterpoint and the opposition, right? And so we really did a deep dive into understanding what is the truth about various low carb philosophies. What is the biochemistry? What can we learn? What are the things that a low fat plant-based whole food philosophy has in common with a low carbohydrate philosophy? And try and make some sense of this whole thing, because as you know, it's confusing, man. It is really confusing in today's world. So point being, we wrote this book, we released it. Within the first week, it actually became a New York Times bestselling book, which we were incredibly, we're so grateful for that and very happy about it. And the response from my perspective has been unbelievable. People have been writing to us and posting on social media about just not only how much the information is really just sort of dumbed down and simplified, but how much it's actually changing their life immediately within, a week or 2 weeks or so of implementing these lessons. So from my perspective, I think it's been very, very helpful. And I would love to see this continue over the course of time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm going to echo what Cyrus said in the sense of the response has really been fantastic. And really, it's all about the testimonials. It's about the number of people that were recommended the book and really just had their minds completely blown, had never heard of this approach. This doesn't make sense. How can you eat all these fruits and potatoes and rice and beans and actually improve your diabetes health? It's mind-boggling to a lot of people. So the fact that it's now in a book and people can share with their doctor, with their friends, with their colleagues is really exciting for us.
Well, congratulations on hitting New York Times bestseller. I remember seeing that message on Instagram, and I sent you guys go boys. I'm so proud of you guys. And I saw your last video on being on the doctors as well. So congratulations on all the success and more importantly, all the people that you're helping. So you mentioned earlier, Cyrus, about controversial points and even some fallacies on diabetes and insulin resistance. What are the top ones that come to mind?
Okay, there's two that come to mind right off the bat. Number one, carbohydrates are bad for you. And if you eat carbohydrates in food, carbohydrates will make you fat, they will make you obese, they will make you more diabetic, and they will raise your cholesterol. Okay, so that's number one. It's the sort of carbophobia that many people in the low carbohydrate and ketogenic world have, these misconceptions about the fact that all carbohydrates are created equal, and that regardless of whether you consume a carbohydrate from a cracker or whether you get carbohydrate from a banana, the two of them act completely the same inside of your body, and they both have detrimental metabolic effects. So that's number one. Number two is insulin resistance itself. Okay, insulin resistance is an underlying condition that causes high blood glucose and causes blood glucose variability. And we can go into a lot of detail about what insulin resistance is and what are the biological mechanisms underlying it. But one of the controversial things that you'll hear over and over again from people in the low carbohydrate world is that insulin itself is what causes insulin resistance. And this statement is perpetuated over and over and over again. They say, okay, you eat carbohydrate, anything that spikes your blood glucose, your pancreas then secretes a large amount of insulin. And then because you have too much insulin floating in your blood, that makes you insulin resistant. And then that is what sets the stage for prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. That is not a true statement at all. And again, we can go into the biochemistry of why that's the case. But all of this sort of starts with a fragmented understanding of carbohydrate metabolism and a fragmented understanding of the interaction between glucose and insulin. And once you can really understand how glucose and insulin communicate with each other and how they behave and how they signal to tissues, then and only then can you really understand what diabetes is and how you can actually reverse insulin resistance using your food as medicine.
Misconceptions. And like Cyrus said, when we wrote the book, we were like, we got to address the elephant in the room. And those chapter 7 is the one on the ketogenic diet, and understanding it from both perspectives is really important. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about this today.
For sure, Robby. So I think we had a chat earlier about nutrition and diet, and back in the day when I was kind of keto and low carb, I followed the Western A price perspective where I was going low carb, I was going on grass-fed organic meats, and also just heaps and heaps of fat. What has your experience been, Robby? Because I know that you went down that path before.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, this was when I had the seed planted in my mind that maybe it's possible to reverse type 1 diabetes. That's what set me down this path of learning about low-fat, plant-based whole food nutrition. And I was just diving into every book, everything I possibly could find about what can you do to enhance the health of your body? How can you improve the chances of your body creating its own beta cells once again? So I read all kinds of stuff, and eventually I did come across the Weston A. Price Foundation. And a lot of stuff that they were saying made sense. I mean, again, like Cyrus was saying, when we're doing the research for the book and we're thinking about this, we have a lot in common with the low carbohydrate world. We really do. We have way more in common than we don't have in common when you think about it. And there's a lot to celebrate in the efforts that are being made in these communities about getting rid of processed food, getting rid of junk food, and really actually being conscious about what you're putting in your body, like actually thinking about the ingredients and being able to list off what you actually ate. Where the biggest problem really in America is people having apathy and not really caring about what they're eating. They don't even look at the ingredients. They can't even name them or say them. The words are so complicated and it's so much rubbish made from factories. So this process of learning about the Weston A. Price Foundation and what to implement, it was a learning experience for me. And at the time, I would go to the local farmer's market and I would buy raw milk for cats because you can't sell that to humans. And so I remember buying lots of grass-fed beef. I remember, the first time I was told it's important to cook the entire chicken. And I mentally really, really struggled with this. But again, I was convinced that I was healthy, and I was actually a freshman. Eventually, I kept on doing this. I brought it into my time as a freshman at the University of Florida. So I had all my own pots and pans. I was making all my own food my first year in the dorms. And I didn't see any major improvement in my diabetes health. That was the biggest problem. So everything we're talking about here, everything we cover in our book really is centered around this fact of what can you do to maximize your insulin sensitivity? And I was not seeing a change in my insulin sensitivity or insulin requirements or blood glucose control. So I eventually went on to try different diets. But at the time, I emailed Sally Fallon, and she replied back to me. I saw this movie Earthlings because some people on a forum had recommended that I check out this movie because it might open up my mind. Because I was on the forum educating them why they should have raw milk. I was like, this is important. You guys are missing out. Like, what are you guys doing? And they were really kind. And I remember I emailed Sally and I was like, look, what do you think about what these people are saying when it comes to nutrition and how we're treating animals? And she just wrote back as like a short reply saying, it's sometimes you basically just have to do what's best for your health. And I mean, at the time, I was confused, and eventually I stumbled across more information, and eventually had the chance to try a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, where immediately I started seeing improvements in my insulin sensitivity, and that was a real eye-opener in the personal experience. As a person living with type 1, we know exactly how much insulin we inject, we count the carbohydrates we consume, and we measure our blood glucose quite frequently. Many of us now wearing continuous glucose monitors. So that journey of seeing how, yeah, a Weston A. Price diet is something to celebrate in the sense that it's progress. But it's not a diet that's going to make you more insulin sensitive. It's not a diet that is going to reduce your chronic disease risk, because again, when you're consuming, we'll get into this in detail, I'm sure Cyrus will cover it, but the excess, you're consuming so much fat on that diet, so much fat, in addition to animal protein and all that, all those concerns. But at the core of it, it's still a very high fat diet. The butter, the raw milk, the whole milk, that was a big thing they were advocating for. And even lean meat is not that lean. So that was really the biggest problem that I had with that approach.
I want to go back to you, Cyrus, about, you mentioned insulin resistance, and Robby, you mentioned insulin sensitivity. That is really the goal, to optimize insulin sensitivity. So backtracking a little bit, insulin resistance, for those that don't really know what that is, you probably would have explained this a million times, but maybe you can just share in layman terms, what does insulin resistance mean, and how does fat, a high amount of fat, actually contributes to insulin resistance?
It's a great question, actually, because it's very confusing. It's unnecessarily confusing. So let's kind of break it down. Okay. When you consume a diet that contains predominantly fat and protein, as is common in the low carbohydrate world. Okay. So low carbohydrate diets contain somewhere between 30 grams of carbohydrate energy and, as upwards of maybe about 150 grams of carbohydrate energy. Okay. There's no consensus on what a low carbohydrate diet truly is, because it's kind of a range. But in the world of ketogenic diets, people consume about 30 grams of total, or net carbohydrate, I should say, which is carbohydrate minus fiber. And some people who are just considered low carbohydrate eaters eat 75, 100, 120, something like that. Okay. Regardless of which type of low carbohydrate eater you are, whether you're very low or whether you're just low, the predominant fuels that you consume in your food become fat and protein. Now, when you consume a diet that's high in fat, somewhere between 60%, 70%, 80% fat, which is not uncommon at all in today's world, the fat that you consume in your food comes in the form of a triglyceride. So fat can be found in both animal-based products as well as plant foods as well. So animal products that contain fat can include things like chicken and red meat and white meat and dairy products and fish and bacon and eggs and beyond. In the plant-based world, foods that contain a significant amount of fat include things like nuts and seeds and avocados and coconuts and olives and things like olive oil. Any type of oil is very fat rich. So whether you're consuming the animal-based fats or the plant-based fats, most of the fat comes in as a triglyceride molecule. So a triglyceride is literally a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids that are covalently attached to it. Okay, so that's why it gets glycerol plus fatty acids gives it the name triglyceride. Okay, so you take this triglyceride molecule, you consume it, it travels down your esophagus, it gets inside of your stomach, it gets inside of your small intestine. Think of your small intestine as basically being a bioreactor. And inside of your small intestine is where the bulk of nutrient digestion and nutrient absorption is supposed to take place. So your small intestine is literally just a tube. And the inside of the tube is where the material from your diet ends up. And inside of that tube, your small intestine is manufacturing enzymes to try and break down the material inside. Your liver and your pancreas are also secreting enzymes. So all 3 of these tissues are putting enzymes into what's called the lumen, or the space on the inside of the tube, in order to start breaking down the stuff that you're eating. So when it comes specifically to fatty acids, again, they're locked up in a triglyceride molecule. there are specific enzymes that are that first separate the glycerol backbone from the fatty acids. And then when those fatty acids are free floating, they're then absorbed through the walls of your small intestine and they get inside of your lymph system, and then they make it into your blood. Okay. So you consume a fat-rich meal, and within hours, those fatty acids are actually inside of your blood. They get put into these things called chylomicron particles. And these chylomicron particles end up circulating using your blood as a highway system to get to tissues all throughout your body. Now, if the fatty acids inside of those chylomicron particles ended up only inside of your adipose tissue or your fat tissue, okay, which is located, it's everywhere. It's in your neck, it's in your armpits, it's in your chest, it's in your butt, your abdomen, you name it. If all of the fatty acids from your food went into the adipose tissue, then diabetes wouldn't really be that big of a deal. It would still exist, but it wouldn't be as prevalent as it is today. And the reason is because your adipose tissue, or your fat tissue, is actually a very safe place to store fatty acids. It's mechanically and enzymatically designed to be able to uptake fatty acids when they're present in your diet, to hold them and store them for a long period of time, and then to release them when the time is right. The problem becomes when you consume a diet that's high in fat, and those fatty acid molecules not only get inside of your adipose tissue, but they also get inside of your liver and they also get inside of your muscle. Now, your liver and muscle have a capacity to be able to store fatty acids in small quantities. They were never designed to be able to store fatty acids in large quantities. And therefore, when fat is present inside of your blood in large quantities and frequently, those two tissues don't have much of a defense mechanism to stop themselves from taking on more fat and more fat and more fat. So when you consume a high-fat meal for breakfast and or for lunch and or for dinner, and then you do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, what ends up happening is that the fatty acids that are inside of those chylomicron particles end up getting inside of your liver and muscle in excess. So both your liver and muscle end up accumulating excess fatty acids, even though that's not the way they were designed. And as a result of that, cells in your liver and cells in your muscle, they go into this self-protective mode to try and block more energy from coming in, because fatty acids contain twice as much energy as amino acids and as glucose. So it's like when fatty acids get inside of the tissue, it's actually a very high energy state. And these tissues are basically saying, whoa, 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 slow down. I don't necessarily want or need this much fatty acid. I never asked for it in the first place. So what these two tissues do is they initiate this thing called insulin resistance. And they say, okay, I'd love to be able to block these fatty acids from coming in, but I don't know how to do that. There's not a very good mechanism to do that within the cell. But if I block insulin from coming inside, or if I block insulin from signaling to the tissue, that will enable me to slow down the rate of fatty acid entrance, and it will enable me to effectively block glucose almost entirely. And that's what they do. They create this thing called insulin resistance, where the insulin receptor becomes less effective, and all the downstream signaling underneath the insulin receptor becomes problematic and it doesn't function as well. Such that the next time you eat something that's carbohydrate rich, whether it's a banana or some bread or a bowl of lentils or some garbanzo beans, anything that contains carbohydrate energy gets broken down into glucose. The glucose wants to get inside of your liver and muscle. So the glucose comes to the door of your liver and muscle, and insulin goes, knock, knock. I got some glucose. Do you want to take it up? And both your liver and muscle, they go, remember, I'm playing insulin resistance. I'm not going to pay attention to you. I'm not going to pay attention to you because I already have this giant lipid particle that has been built up over time. I got to burn that stuff first. And this whole insulin signaling cascade, this thing doesn't even work that well anymore. So sorry, see you later. So insulin tries to knock on the door of the liver and muscle, and it gets trapped in the blood. Can't do anything. Can't do very much. Glucose ends up getting trapped inside of your blood as well, because it can't get inside of your liver and muscle. So what people who are eating a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet experience every single time is they'll eat a lot of high fat foods, and they'll create this thing called insulin resistance inside of their liver and muscle. They'll eat one banana or one small plate of beans or one small serving of rice. And then within 2 hours, they'll check their blood glucose. Boom, they'll see a high number on their blood glucose meter. And they'll look at it and they'll go, that's weird. 175. That's weird. 240. I guess carbohydrates are bad for me, right? I told you, look, I proved it to you. I just proved it to you. I ate one banana and my blood glucose went into the 200s. I ate one tiny serving of beans and my blood glucose is super high, right? And so it further reinforces this idea that carbohydrates are bad for you, that carbohydrates are the problem, and that if you eat anything containing carbohydrate, your blood glucose is going to continue to go high. But what they're not paying attention to is that it's actually the high blood glucose is just a symptom of another thing altogether. And the other thing is the traffic jam called insulin resistance. And so if you really understand how this whole mechanism plays out, then if I gave you the responsibility of reversing insulin resistance, rather than paying attention to the result, the symptom, which is high blood glucose, you go backwards and you say, well, what caused the traffic jam in the first place? And the thing that caused the traffic jam in the first place was an excess consumption of fat, not the consumption of fat in moderation, not the consumption of fat in small amounts, but the consumption of excess fat, particularly saturated fat. And when you consume excess saturated fat over the course of time, you create the traffic jam that inhibits insulin signaling. It traps glucose and insulin in your blood. It creates high blood glucose, and now you have a problem. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Going into that, actually, I fully resonate with that, because back in the day when I was on a low carb diet, I was literally having like little bowls of rice, and I even eliminated my rice and my fruits and stuff. Imagine an Asian not having rice, like, whoa.
Well, yeah, that's unheard of.
It's unheard of, isn't it? And I was just like, oh, it must be the rice, and it must be that one banana. So I fully understand that kind of dilemma that I went through, and many people do as well. So with that in mind, how does, let's say we talk about the Western A Prize Foundation, where they advocate organic grass-fed meats. How is there any better? Does that in a way elevate your risk of diabetes, insulin resistance, or chronic disease, even though it's considered clean meats?
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. And there's a lot of people who will say that. They'll say, oh, okay, it's Cyrus, Robby, Luke. Meat's not the problem. Cheese is not the problem. The problem is the quality of the meat that you're consuming. It's the industrialized cows that create hormone-fed, antibiotic-fed products, including meat and dairy products. And it's the hormones, it's the antibiotics, it's the synthetic vitamins and minerals inside of the meat that's actually triggering a number of adverse metabolic effects that cause chronic disease. And you know what? The answer is, you're right. It absolutely is. Those things are terrible for you, right? Even the organic pesticides that are used on the food that those animals are consuming, all of that stuff is detrimental. It's napalm to your cardiovascular system and to your blood glucose control. But even if you cleaned it up, and even if you fed your animal the cleanest food possible, and they were free range and they were cage free and they were consuming their natural diet, you will still develop, you can still easily create a collection. What am I trying to say? You can easily create insulin resistance simply by consuming a diet that contains too much fat. Okay. Now, I want to be perfectly clear here. Robby and I are both 100% plant-based eaters. We understand that not necessarily everybody wants to be a 100% plant-based eater. So I don't want to come across as though I'm saying you either have to be 100% plant-based or nothing. And if you are not 100% plant-based, then you're going to be insulin resistant and diabetic. And because it's not a true statement at all. But the truth is that as you migrate towards a more plant-rich diet, especially if the plants that you're consuming are green leafy vegetables, fruits, starchy vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, and that sort of makes up the bulk of your meals, then you can actually eat your way to insulin sensitivity, right? You reverse insulin resistance using your diet. But if you choose to have a little bit of meat and or dairy products in your diet, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not the food police. You can do whatever you want to do. But the idea here is that at a certain point when you're putting those foods in, you can easily get to a point where you are developing the symptomology of insulin resistance, which can certainly raise your risk for prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and a whole host of other chronic diseases as well.
I just want to add to this conversation here. part of the reason we are so passionate about this and so adamant about explaining the science is because of the personal experience we have had ourselves, in addition to hundreds and hundreds of people also living with type 1 diabetes. And like I said, we are the best test subjects in the real world to truly, truly understand insulin sensitivity. And there's published research on people following a low carbohydrate diet. As far as I know, they were eating pretty clean meats in there. And it's with people living with type 1 diabetes, okay, eating 30 grams of total carbohydrate per day, and then injecting 30 units of total insulin per day. That's a 1-to-1 24-hour insulin sensitivity ratio. And then you have people on the other end of the spectrum, Cyrus and I, consuming over 700 grams of carbohydrate per day and still using less total insulin. Cyrus is around 25 units per day. I'm around 27 units per day. So we're eating a dramatically larger amount of total carbohydrate energy and seeing our insulin sensitivity go through the roof. Now, look, if it was just for an N of 2, like that doesn't mean much. It's like, oh, what's the big deal? But then when you go and look at over 100 years of evidence-based research, clearly explaining exactly what Cyrus just went over, and then you see it in hundreds and hundreds of clients, and you do not see any exceptions. I mean, it's one of those things that it truly is black and white. Like, you absolutely positively, no way can one of those people who's doing a low carbohydrate diet, they're eating 30 grams of carbohydrate right now, and using 30, there's no way like the next day or within a couple of days they could somehow eat a lot of carbohydrate and then be insulin sensitive. It's not possible. And they say, oh, well, we need to carb adapt. Well, the only way to carb adapt is to start applying principles of the Mastering Diabetes method, which is increasing your whole carbohydrate intake and lowering your fat intake. Like, this is just repeatable over and over and over again without exception.
So you mentioned, Robby, it's been hundreds of years of research. Where have we got lost along the way? Because since this research has been around, and I know of the Walter Kempner study as well, why is there still such a confusion? Where does it stem from based on your research?
I wish I had the answer to that question. I wish I understood how did this happen. I think part of the problem is that diabetes is one of the few conditions that you can self-monitor. So if you have heart disease, you don't know if your heart disease got better or worse after one meal. If you have kidney disease, you don't know. You don't have a metric. But with diabetes, just like Cyrus explained, people can eat a bowl of rice, eat a potato, eat some bananas, test their blood glucose all by themselves, and instantly see meal by meal, oh my gosh, there's a high reading. And this confusion has set in. And I think a lot of it comes back to peer-reviewed research that's not actually studying a low-fat diet when they claimed to be following a low-fat diet. So you can find a lot of very high-quality studies, randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, where they say they're comparing a low-carbohydrate diet to a low-fat diet, and at the end of the day, the low-carbohydrate diet saw, maybe a little more weight loss, maybe their A1C was a little bit lower, maybe their glycemic variability was lower, and they say, yep, low carbohydrate diets performed better. That's what we should be advocating for people living with diabetes. But the mistake is they didn't compare it to a truly low-fat diet. So when we say low-fat, we're talking about a maximum of 15% of calories coming from fat per day. And in these research studies, people are using 20, 25, up to 35% of calories coming from fat and calling that the low-fat diet, putting that as the low-fat group. And that's a big mistake. So I think that's definitely part of the confusion, but honestly, why this research has been hidden and buried and not brought to light is still mind-boggling to me.
So, Robby, you mentioned earlier about testing, and my understanding of testing is you want to test your A1C values just to test your where your blood sugar sits. Beyond that, I understand that you guys also track your insulin to carbohydrate ratio. Based on what I read on your book. Maybe you could expand on that as well and how that is relevant to someone.
I'll touch on a little bit of blood work here, and I'm sure Cyrus can add in a little bit as well. But one of the most important tests in the world of diabetes that we advocate for is a C-peptide test. And a C-peptide test will allow you to gain insight into how much insulin your pancreas is producing. So C-peptide and insulin are produced in a 1-to-1 ratio. C-peptide breaks off and floats around in your body, and it's actually easier to measure. So we can look at that test and see, okay, wait a minute, is your insulin production low, medium, or high? And people living with type 1 diabetes will inevitably fall in the low category, okay? So our pancreas has been damaged. We're not producing sufficient quantities of insulin. Our C-peptide is low. Some people, they can fall in the medium or high category. That's going to be more of people living with prediabetes and type 2. So prediabetes are likely going to be high, meaning they're producing excess insulin. And then in the medium category, you might find people who have basically, they've had an exhausted pancreas. They don't have type 1, they don't have antibodies, but they have an exhausted pancreas that just isn't producing as much insulin as it used to, all right? So the reason I bring that up is to just illustrate this point of the fact that being aware of how much insulin is being produced in your body is an important equation here. Now, for the carbohydrate to insulin ratio comes into play for people who are living with insulin-dependent diabetes and using fast-acting insulin. That's where that number really comes into play. So that's people living with type 1. That's people living with type 1.5, which is a slow onset version of type 1. And that's people living with insulin-dependent type 2, where they've had it for so long that their beta cells are exhausted and they simply cannot produce sufficient quantities of insulin. They're more like a type 1 without the antibodies. So in that case, we can use this data of, okay, how much insulin are you injecting and how much total grams of carbohydrate are you consuming per day? And that can be a measure of insulin sensitivity, which we consider this to be a valid measure because you are looking at insulin's included here, and you're also looking at carbohydrate intake or glucose intake, all right? Whereas there are some other metrics for measuring insulin sensitivity that don't include a glucose challenge. So HOMA-IR is one of these. If people listen to this, read a lot of research, they've probably heard of that, but that's a way where you can assess insulin sensitivity based on simply your fasting blood glucose level, and I believe also your C-peptide level. Am I right on that, Cyrus? HOMA-IR only looks at those two metrics?
Yeah, fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin levels. Right?
Fasting insulin, that's right. It doesn't look at C-peptide. There's another version that does look at C-peptide, but it's right, fasting insulin. So in that case, you're not including a glucose challenge, which is incredibly important when you're looking at insulin sensitivity. So again, we see this in our clients, literally changes in insulin sensitivity of 500%, 600%. I personally saw a change in my glucose tolerance of over 900%. And that was ability, we can use softwares like Chronometer to really take out fiber and take out fructose. For the skeptics out there that say, oh, you guys see a really big improvement in your insulin sensitivity because you're eating lots of fiber, which doesn't require insulin, and there's a lot of fructose in your diet, which doesn't require insulin. And I'm like, no. Let's run the numbers here. It's very clear when you measure just the glucose you're consuming that you'll see an improvement in your insulin sensitivity. So again, this goes back to a lot of the research. You can go and look at a lot of valid methods for testing insulin sensitivity. The euglycemic clamp is the gold standard. But again, in just everyday humans who are using fast-acting insulin, we have this very clear measure of, okay, how efficiently is your body able to take glucose out of your bloodstream based on how much insulin you're injecting over a 24-hour period. I hope that makes sense.
There are multiple things that you can do to get your blood glucose to be flat. And there are multiple things that you can do to reduce your insulin concentration in your blood, okay? So if you came to me and you said, hey, Cyrus, I got high blood glucose and or high insulin, what should I do? Okay. I could answer that question in a number of different ways. I could say, all right, let's get you to be more active because exercise will drop your blood glucose and it will drop your insulin levels. I could get you to start intermittent fasting because that will also drop your blood glucose and drop your insulin levels. I could get you to eat a low carbohydrate diet because that'll also drop your blood glucose and drop your insulin levels. I could get you to eat a low fat plant-based whole food diet because that will also drop your blood glucose, and drop your insulin levels. So there's many people who say, okay, well, there's many ways to solve this problem, which is a true statement, but not all of these, what I just described, some of them are sustainable, some of them are not sustainable, and some of them have adverse long-term complications. Low carbohydrate diets have adverse long-term complications. Exercising is great. Don't get me wrong. You exercise frequently. I do. Robby does. And that's something that's a central component inside of the Mastering Diabetes method. But you can exercise all you want. And if you don't change your diet, then you're going to have, higher blood glucose and problems down the road. Okay. So because there's multiple things you can do to keep your blood glucose flatlined and to drop your insulin levels, there becomes a lot of controversy of like, no, I did this. No, you said this. No, how come I did this? No, my cousin did this and my dad did this and this didn't work for me and this works for you, yada, 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 right? Now, one thing that the American Diabetes Association also has set forth is they basically say, listen, if you're going to get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which affects 92% of the diabetes population, okay, there's one of 4 ways that you can become classified as living with type 2 diabetes. Okay. Number 1, your A1C value is greater than 5.7%. Okay. Your A1C is basically just a marker of your average blood glucose. You go to the doctor, you take a blood test. If they see that your A1C value is greater than 5.7%, right there, you have either pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Okay. That's number 1. Number 2, a random finger stick blood glucose at any point in the day. I take a finger stick blood glucose, and if it's greater than 200, boom, right there, you have type 2 diabetes. No questions asked. Okay. Number 3, a high fasting insulin level. If your fasting insulin level is elevated, then boom, right off the bat, you have type 2 diabetes. And then the 4th one is if you take an oral glucose tolerance test. And if you take an oral glucose tolerance test and you fail the oral glucose tolerance test, then you have type 2 diabetes. And what that means, you go to a doctor, they give you this solution that contains water and glucose, you drink it. Over the course of the next 2 hours, they monitor your blood glucose and they see how high it goes and then how low it comes back down. If at any point in that process it goes over 200, boom, right there, you have type 2 diabetes. Okay. Now, those are the classification criteria in order to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. If you go to the research and you try and look at papers and try and understand when people make claims like I'm reversing diabetes, this new thing, this new method, this new way of eating reverses diabetes, what you will generally find, which is what Robby was suggesting, is that they will measure fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, and A1C. Very rarely, in fact, almost never are they using an oral glucose tolerance test to determine how their response to a carbohydrate challenge was. And what most people will find, if you follow a low carbohydrate diet for some period of time, and then you take an oral glucose tolerance test, you are very likely to fail the oral glucose tolerance test. Your blood glucose is likely to go over 200. And that right there means that even though your blood glucose is very well controlled 99% of the time because you're eating a low carbohydrate diet, you are still intolerant of carbohydrate energy. You are still intolerant of glucose energy. And that right there is not only a problem because it raises your risk for other chronic diseases, it's an actual classification of type 2 diabetes, according to the American Diabetes Association. Right? So this is why it gets confusing, because the research doesn't do a very good job of using the correct test to actually determine whether you are living with type 2 diabetes or not. And if you avoid using that test, then you come to the conclusion that because your fasting blood glucose is low, your fasting insulin is low, and your A1C is low, then type 2 diabetes has disappeared. When in reality, it's there. It's just that you're not measuring it properly. And because you're not measuring it, you're blinded to it. And because you're blinded to it, you think it's gone. In reality, it's still with you. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. So now shifting gears a little now to immunity, because I think we're in a period where there's COVID and some people are being locked up. what's your take on, the immune system and how insulin resistance actually affects it?
Go to the CDC's website and you say, who is at risk for complications of the coronavirus, or who is at risk for complications from any viral infection? What they will tell you is that the people who are at the highest risk for coronavirus in particular are people that have a pre-existing lung condition, specifically asthma, people who are living with hypertension, people who are living with any form of diabetes, and people who also have either stage 4 or stage 5 chronic kidney disease and or are on dialysis. Okay. And in addition to that, they'll also point out people who are 65 years or older. And they'll say, if any one of these things is true, then you're at risk for higher complications. And it is a true statement. All of those are true statements. Okay. Insulin resistance is the underlying condition that causes prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So what I would say is that, yes, if you're living with some form of diabetes, you are at a higher risk than somebody who doesn't have a pre-existing condition. But more generally, if you're living with insulin resistance, because insulin resistance raises your risk for many other chronic metabolic diseases, insulin resistance itself is actually it can suppress your immunity, and it suppresses your immunity for a number of reasons. Okay. Insulin resistance and hypertension, both of them impair blood flow. Okay. Both of them are problems of the vasculature. Both of them impair the ability of specific types of cells to get into tissues, for things like insulin to signal to tissues, for glucose to get into tissues, for oxygen to get into tissues, and most importantly, for immune cells to get into tissues where they belong. So if you develop the coronavirus infection and you actually are infected with it, the coronavirus can basically take residence inside of your lungs. It can take residence inside of your liver. It can take residence inside of your intestine. It can take residence inside of your kidney. Now, if you are going to have a difficult time getting immune cells to the location, to the site of injury, then that's considered suppressed immunity. And living with some type of metabolic condition, whether it's hypertension, whether it's diabetes, whether it's chronic kidney disease, whether it's fatty liver disease, whether it's pre-existing asthma, all of those just simply impair blood flow. And when you impair blood flow, then cells in your immune system cannot get access to those tissues very well. And as a result of that, the ambulances and the first responders inside of your system are not capable of mounting an effective immune response. And as a result of that, the infection can persist for a longer period of time. The infection can grow, and the infection can turn into a complication that can eventually become life-threatening. So a really simple way to think about this whole thing is, what can I do to improve blood flow? What can I do that's going to improve my cardiovascular health? What can I do that's going to dramatically improve the ability of cells inside of my blood to get to tissues anywhere, whether it's my brain, my thyroid gland, my lungs, my liver, my kidney, you name it, okay? And becoming insulin sensitive is one way to improve blood flow. There's no question about it, okay? Adopting an exercise regimen is one way to improve blood flow. There's no question about it. Eating green leafy vegetables is one way to improve blood flow. Eating nitrate-rich vegetables itself improves blood flow, okay? Performing intermittent fasting improves blood flow, okay? Having a little bit of vinegar inside of your food improves blood flow. There's 1,000 things you can do. And really the idea here is, if you can really improve blood flow, then you're giving immune cells inside of your blood a stronger chance of getting to the site of infection and dramatically reducing your risk for many complications.
My understanding of an optimal immune system would be obviously all those factors that you shared earlier: being outside, being outdoors, being next to nature, getting the sunlight. So how is a person's immune system compromised by being at home?
Yeah, right. Being in a sort of like sterile environment. So truth be told here, I'm not an immunologist. I'm not a virologist by any stretch of the imagination. So I almost view it as like, it's like there's two things you have to weigh. Okay. On one hand, you want to limit your exposure to people who are carrying the coronavirus. So you want to limit your exposure to surfaces that have the coronavirus on it. Okay. So that's the reason why people are going to want to socially distance themselves and or quarantine themselves, right? Because if you don't do that and you are interacting with lots of people, you're going to the grocery store all the time, you're going to restaurants, you just dramatically increase your risk for the transmission of coronavirus inside of you. And that right there is something you're trying to avoid at all costs. Okay. So on one hand, you're basically trying to avoid the transmission. On the other hand, you're trying to do things that are going to not suppress your immunity or do things that are going to boost your immunity. Right. And being sheltered in a environment that is somewhat sterile, being, using hand sanitizer all the time, using an alcohol-based cleaner on multiple surfaces, not going outside and interacting with the world, right? Not ingesting particulate matter inside of the air. Like, your immune system is basically develops over the course of time and strengthens over the course of time because you get constant exposure to these pathogens, right? So when you limit your exposure to these pathogens, then technically speaking, you are suppressing your immunity, right? So I always ask myself the question, what's more important, right? Do I want to slightly suppress my immunity by staying at home and dramatically reduce my risk for exposure? Or do I want to keep my immune system strong by going outside and dramatically increase my risk for exposure? Okay. And so if you ask me that question personally, my answer is I'd rather stay at home and quarantine myself and dramatically lower my risk for exposure by not being around other people temporarily, right? Because not only am I going to dramatically drop my risk for exposure, but secondarily, there are things that I can do at home that are actually going to boost my immunity. So I can do both of them at the same time. I can cut my risk for exposure and I can boost my immunity. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to eat foods that I know have specific antiviral activity, like onions raw, like garlic raw, like green tea. Okay. When you do that on a daily basis, then you're actually boosting your immunity simply by consuming the right types of foods. In addition to that, when you get 30 minutes of moderate activity on a daily basis, activity has a profound immune boosting activity. Okay. So when you're doing that on a daily basis, that right there is actually improving your immunity. Okay. And in addition to that, if you go outside and you get a little bit of UV radiation, you get a little bit of sun exposure, that right there has a profound impact on your immunity. And in addition to that, if you keep your environment low stress, that has a profound impact on your immunity, right? So if you're putting all those lifestyle factors into play and you happen to be at home, to me, I say, I don't care. That's fine with me. I'll temporarily limit my exposure to a bunch of pathogens so that I can dramatically reduce my risk for the development of coronavirus. And if I do that, then I'm stacking the cards in my favor, and I'm not really worried personally about suppressing my immunity in any way, shape, or form.
So for someone that's watching who may be diabetic or suffering from prediabetes, or even just a fitness professional, everyday person, there's a fear and is afraid of change. And what would you say to them to kind of jump and take that leap of faith to try this different approach of eating and living?
I think step one is they got to read this book. Okay. It's called Mastering Diabetes. You can get it everywhere. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. This thing can be shipped to you internationally from Book Depository, free shipping. We read our own audiobook. I mean that sincerely. We put our heart and soul into this, and we believe so much. We know so much through the research of once you optimize your insulin sensitivity, you are going to have a cascade of benefits beyond just improving your diabetes health, beyond just improving your blood glucose. You're reducing your risk of a long, long list of chronic conditions, including heart disease, kidney disease, fatty liver disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, Alzheimer's, PCOS. The list goes on and on and on. So step one is to get educated. You once you know and understand a little more what's going on, it's a lot easier to make decisions. And then I think the really one action item, what do you actually do beyond getting educated, is start your day with a fruit-based breakfast. Eat 4 servings of your favorite fruit, add in some ground chia seeds, ground flax seeds for essential fatty acid insurance policy, add some greens, add some non-starchy vegetables. This can be the beginning, a true beginning of an entirely, life-changing transformation. And you start to feel a little better. You get excited about how these foods taste. And all of a sudden you're encouraged to keep going and keep learning more, and you never look back.
Very well said. Very well said. I mean, here's the beauty is that it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to start the process of improving your insulin sensitivity and dramatically reducing your blood glucose levels and your oral medication and or insulin requirements. So just like Robby said, starting with a fruit breakfast is something that's absolutely no questions asked, makes a dramatic difference, and it doesn't really take that much time. It takes, days, and 3, 4, 5, 7 days, you will likely see improvements in your blood glucose. Even if your blood glucose goes up to begin with, it's okay. Stick with it and watch over the course of a couple of days as your blood glucose response gets better and better. And eventually over the course of 7 days, 10 days, 14 days, your glucose should be much better controlled simply by eating that low-fat, plant-based whole food breakfast that's fruit heavy. In addition to that, another thing that we are huge fans of is daily movement. And I also bring that up, Luke, because you do CrossFit. I do CrossFit. The two of us are, addicted to exercise. And I know Robby is super active on a daily basis as well. I mean, all three of us perform exercise because we like it, because we love it, but it also helps us improve our metabolic health. And it specifically helps Robby and I maintain a really flatline blood glucose. So the beauty with exercise here is that it doesn't have to be strenuous. It doesn't have to be high intensity. It doesn't have to be 60 to 90 minutes at a time. People get the perception that they have to go kill themselves and they have to be lying in a pool of sweat at the very end. And if they don't, then it's not going to work. And the answer is that's not true. Okay. We know that that's not a true statement. Literally going on a walk can alter your blood glucose values. You can drop your blood glucose by 30 to 50 points. Okay. And if you, have a little bit more of a desire to push your body a little bit harder, go on a jog, go on a hike, get on a bicycle, get on a row machine, go swimming, go to the gym, okay, join a Zumba class. I don't really care I honestly don't care. I just want you to move your body on a daily basis. And when you do that in combination with a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, I kid you not, the sky is the limit. It's so effective. It's mind-boggling.
Indeed, guys. Well, thank you very much for what you've been sharing with us today. I'm sure it's going to help many more people out there. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Luke, for having us here on this on the summit, and also for you and Toby are doing such a fantastic job of getting the word out and really teaching people around the world what they can do to make a lifestyle that's sustainable, that provides incredible results, long-lasting results. So thank you. Keep up the good work. You guys are reaching thousands of people around the planet, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Luke, it's really an honor to have us included, and you have such an amazing lineup of speakers. So I hope people take the time to make sure they listen to every other interview you guys have put together and really learn a lot and change their lives.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.